All right, welcome back. Session 5 continues. We talk about Gerald Ford as the first non-elected president of the United States. So a little background on Gerald Ford. Ford was first elected to Congress in 1948 and was re-elected every 2 years until 1972, or through 1972. In December of 73, Nixon appoints him vice president after Spiro Agnew resigns. Basically, Gerald Ford was doing the best he could. He was a honest, hardworking man. In Congress, he was seen as not too coordinated or not too bright. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Johnson, joked that maybe Ford had played too many football games without his helmet. Saturday Night Live did a skit, if you want to look those up, of Chevy Chase as Gerald Ford basically being the not too coordinated falling down. There's an incident where he's getting off of Air Force One, Gerald Ford is, and he slipped and fell down. So basically, a lot of the comedy back then took it and ran with it. So if you look up the early days of Saturday Night Live, you'll see Chevy Chase making fun of President Ford. So President Ford wanted to go ahead and get Watergate put behind them. He pardoned Nixon of his crimes. This pretty much angered a lot of Americans who wanted Nixon to pay for what they did. But Nixon never paid for it, but over 40 of his associates did go to prison for their roles in the Watergate scandal. Also, this is where you get everything called Gate, Benghazi Gate, Deflate Gate. It all came from the Watergate debacle back in the 70s. So basically, Ford took over a horrible situation at the time. So Nixon actually probably helped himself by getting out of it, because who knows if he could have solved all the problems that were happening here in the United States. So in April of 75, Saigon falls, as well as South Vietnam, and the world watches that happen. Inflation and unemployment reaches its highest level since 1941, and the oil-producing nations of the world raised their oil prices by 400%, causing a gas shortage. So Ford responds to raising the rise of inflation was to have Americans wear buttons that had the acronym of WIN, or Whip Inflation Now. That didn't work, and Ford didn't want to take a whole lot of action to try to help with inflation. He neglected to address wage and price controls and did very little to lessen the United States dependence on foreign oil. At one time, we produced our own oil. During this time, we bought oil from other countries, and when they raised the price, it hurt us a great deal. That's probably why you see domestic production up here in the United States, so we don't need to rely on foreign oil, yet we still do. Interesting question to ask. So when the oil prices shot up in the United States, or were raised by the oil-producing countries, it really hurt the United States, and basically a lot of stuff that was made with oil. So you have the bicentennial election of 1976. The pardon of Nixon, the end of Vietnam, and the economy proved to be the downfall for Ford. Ford barely won the nomination over Governor Ronald Reagan from California, and the Democrats nominated former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter is elected president in the election of 1976. So you can see on the electoral map where Carter basically won. So in some of the bigger states with the bigger numbers for the electoral college, like Texas, New York, Pennsylvania. So Jimmy Carter, President James Jimmy Carter, was a graduate of the Naval Academy. He's probably one of the, I would guess, book smart presidents. He's a nuclear engineer. He went to the Naval Academy. He also was a peanut farmer. He also ran as a Washington outsider. Sound like anyone we know in this election. He's the first candidate to defeat an incumbent president since 1932, and he is also the first president from the Deep South since the Civil War. Basically, he was elected on the idea of change, and what people were looking for was that change, so that's why they elected Carter. So during the 1976 campaign, Carter added up the nation's unemployment rate with inflation level and called it the misery index and used it against Ford. By the time he took office, the misery index had gone up. The annual inflation rate had changed the prices of various consumer goods and went up from 5% in 1970 to 14.5% in 1980. The price of gasoline went up from 40 cents to more than 70 cents. You have to remember, this is the 70s. It's not now. I mean, yes, gas at 70 cents would be nice now, but you have to add inflation to that for, 40 years later. Part of the reason for the rise of inflation and the high oil prices was America's increasing dependence on foreign oil. In the early 70s, Arab oil producing companies cut off supplies to the U.S. and other Western nations because they were backing Israel and in the 1967 war. So when the embargo was lifted, Western oil reserves were gone, and basically oil producing nations could charge what they wanted. So we ran out of oil, and they said, well, you need it so bad, here's how much it's going to cost. So America has a great crisis of confidence. With higher oil prices, fueled inflation, which triggers higher interest rates. Companies couldn't afford to borrow money to expand, so unemployment rose. Carter tried to prevent problems by including voluntary wage and price controls. It got so bad that Carter went on TV to recognize that the nation was having a crisis of confidence. And to many people, that made Carter look like a crybaby. Things are so bad. On his foreign policy issues, he had mixed results. He had some great things happen. He also had some things that didn't really work real well. He negotiated the return of the Panama Canal to Panama in 1999. Still out on that. He signed the SALT II treaty with the Soviet Union, which restricted the development of new nuclear weapons. He continued to restore relations with Communist China. Probably his biggest victory, one that still rings true today, is the Camp David Accords, basically ending open hostility between Israel and Egypt. The Camp David Accords were signed by President Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin. They both received the Nobel Peace Prize for this. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was overthrown by a religious coup led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. The United States basically put the Shah in power, so they helped him get out of the country. They allowed him to come to the United States for medical treatment for his cancer. This basically made the Iranians very angry. Also in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Basically, Carter's reaction to the invasion of Afghanistan was to boycott the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. So this is what President Carter has to deal with as he is getting ready to run for re-election. So on November 4th, 1979, these Iranians attack and capture the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Some of these hostages were allowed to leave, but 52 were held prisoner. They were held prisoner for 144 days. So, like we were saying, the Americans let the Shah come to the United States for cancer treatment. This angered the Iranians, so they attacked the embassy. They demanded the Shah be returned to Iran. to stand trial for crimes against the Iranian people. Until the Shah was returned, they declared the Americans would remain hostage. Carter refused to accept the demands of the Iranians and condemned their actions. He was supported by the United States. Carter basically freezes all Iranian oil and assets in the United States. In April 1980, he authorizes a rescue mission, basically to get into Tehran and rescue the hostages. The problem is it ran into mechanical problems when 5 helicopters were damaged in, basically they're flying through the desert, so wind or sand gets into their turbines, it ruins the helicopters, they had to stop. So it cancels the mission. As the troops were preparing to leave, another helicopter crashed into a transport plane, killing 8 Americans and wounding many others. This does not bode well for the United States. It doesn't look good for the United States. It makes us look kind of weak that we couldn't even rescue our own people from these Iranians that had taken them. So this is what President Carter goes into the election of 1980 with. So as the election approaches, Carter becomes unpopular with the American people. Inflation in the early 1980, inflation was at 15%. Unemployment was 8% nationwide, and in some areas up to 20%. Interest rates were at their highest levels in more than 100 years, forcing businesses to close, file for bankruptcy. It prevented people from buying houses and cars. When Carter announced that he would seek re-election, his approval rating was set at 21%. The Republicans chose former California Governor Ronald Reagan to run in 1980. Remember, he lost the nomination to Ford in 1976. During the campaign, Reagan focused on the economy and America's declining military strength abroad, what happened in Iran. Reagan said he would balance the budget, reduce federal regulations on business, and increase defense spending. Carter called Reagan's military buildup a dangerous threat to peace. Carter also criticized Reagan's belief that the budget could be balanced while taxes were lowered and defense spending was increased. The American people didn't see it that way. So in November 1980, Reagan wins a landslide victory, carrying 44 states with a total of 489 electoral votes compared to Carter's 49. So that does it for the election of 1980. When you guys tune in next time, we will be talking about President Reagan and his presidency. Basically, it will be Morning in America. That was one of his slogans for the campaign, and we'll be talking about that when you start our next discussion.